the most common act that you're going to use for the dispensing of license is the Medicine and Related Substances Act. I hope everybody hears me. Can you hear me, guys? Am I audible enough? Okay, super. So it's the Medicine and Related Substances Act 101 of 1965 as amended. So you'll see that the act will continuously get amended, and they are using section 49 for all the amendments. So what we're going to focus on today is prescription book regulations. So this will be the regulations that are required for you to actually keep records in your clinic, your private practice, or wherever you'll be working and dispensing medication. And we'll also look at Schedule 6 register and the prescription themselves. So here, obviously, it's dual recording. You'll have the prescription, it's on itself, and then you will have a register where you need to be recording, the receiving of medication, the dispensing, and then also issuing, or if you are selling of such medication. Then we'll look at the legal requirements for a prescription. What makes a prescription a legal document, and then things that would be outstanding would make it a document that won't be legal, which would be an illegal document. We'll also look at generic substitution. So what are the factors that one needs to look at when you are substituting medicines from your proprietary brand to your generic medication? Ethical consideration. Lastly, the key factors that you look at when you are actually evaluating a prescription. And in this case, that will be what you would need to meet when you are prescribing for your patients. So prescription books, these are permanent records. They can either be handwritten or typed. So if they're typed, you'll need to have a system that you back up such records. And such a system must be secured so that people cannot have access to such records, because such records needs to be kept confidential. And what are the information that will be needs to be kept in such a prescription book? So here you'll see that there's a difference between your schedule 0 to 1, and then from schedule 2 to 6. So schedule 0 and 1, you have limited requirements of information that you need to record. Actually, if you look schedule 0, you'll actually find it anywhere. Wine shops, spaza shops. And then for schedule 1, you will need to always have the patient name and address and the name of the drug that you are actually issuing to the patient and the quantity, and that's it. However, when you move to schedule 2, going up to 6, because those are the only schedules we are allowed to use. Schedule 7, it's actually for research purposes. It's something that you won't be actually seeing in your institution. The first requirement is that if you are issuing such medication, you need to always have a reference number that it's linked to that you have issued. The name and the address of the patient, very important. And the reason you would need these two, it's for medicine quality purposes, but also for product quality, where you find that there's a recall for medication, and you find that the recall actually requires that all patients return all the medication that have been issued. So for us to be able to track such patients, we'll use the address so that you can locate such patient. So the patient name and the address becomes very important in such factors. Then you date when the prescription was dispensed. This obviously would actually be linked to the validity of the prescription. So a prescription, we know that it's valid for 30 days, but So a prescription is valid for 30 days, but you realize that for antibiotics, if you prescribe it and it's a 7-day course, you can't still say it's valid for 30 days. So you'll sometimes need to use your discretion. So if a patient has been given an antibiotic, they might have told them that you shouldn't start the antibiotic immediately, but you must wait maybe for 5 days. So that means you can give it a leeway of 14 days for it to be valid. Anything beyond that, it might not really bear the therapeutic outcome that you would have actually desired. Then you'll have to have the name of the medicine, the dosage form, the quantity. And here, if you make some alterations, let's say on the prescription it was written a capsule and then you gave a tablet, that needs to be actually recorded either on the label of the medication or on your electronic records or on the script itself. And you'll see later on when we look at generic medication where you find that you have medications that are generic, but the dosage form is different. They don't have the same dosage form, but they are actually declared equivalent. So there you will need to obviously be able to record such differences so that if there's any queries around the therapeutic outcome that the patient is actually getting, then you can actually be able to go back and check if whether you gave the right dosage form like the previous proprietary medication. Obviously, the name of the prescriber who has written the prescription is very important here. So that needs to be recorded on the prescription book. And then all these records need to be kept within the premises where the medication is being issued for 5 years. And beyond that, you need to archive them for another 20 years. So all in all, the records need to be kept for 25 years. Your Schedule 6 register. Here you would see that these are highly controlled substances or medicines. And for every receipt or supply of the medication, it needs to be recorded and a date needs to be enacted on the register. And here you will see also that you will need to record the name and the business address of the person from whom the medication is coming from. So if you are buying the medication from a wholesale, you'll need to record where the wholesale that has supplied you with the medication, and all the information, you'll always find it in the invoice of the medication. So like the address and the name of the wholesale. Then it will be the name and the address of the person who is buying the medication. So in this case, if you are a clinic, you will have to write the address of your clinic and the person that is in charge of the clinic and record it there. And the quantity, obviously, of the medication that you have actually ordered of your Schedule 6. And that needs to be written in both words and figures and indicate dose per unit. And in this case, the dose per unit will be either if it's milligram per mils, if it's syrups, and then if it's tablets, it's just milligrams. You need to actually indicate that and the total quantity that you have ordered. In the case of supply of such medicine or substances in a prescription, obviously the name and the address of the authorized prescriber needs to be to appear on the prescription. And on a quarterly basis, the register needs to be balanced. So on a quarterly basis, in March, June, September, and December, you need to sit down, and you can't do this alone. You need to always do it in duplicate. So that means you'll need to find another person to confirm the quantity that you are balancing and the actual number of tablets that you have counted. So if your register says 100, so there must be a second person who confirms that you actually have 100 tablets in your cupboard of Schedule 6 medicines. So that needs to be done on a quarterly basis, and it's done on 4 times a year. And the other thing that you need to know about Schedule 6 is that you'll get audited on an ad hoc basis. No one will tell you. The Medicine and Related Substances Act requires that SAHPRA, which is the South African Health Product Regulatory Authority, every now and then they might actually just choose a healthcare facility that they'll come and audit your Schedule 6 and 5 medication, but mostly Schedule 6. And if you have Schedule 6 medication that have expired, you cannot dispose them without informing SAHPRA. So you'll need to apply to SAHPRA for them to give you a license to dispose such medication. So if you don't have a disposal license and you dispose such medication, you might actually find yourself into trouble. The other thing about Schedule 6 is that you cannot repeat the prescription. So every time you need to refill your medication, you need to obviously get a new prescription. So if you get a prescription of Schedule 6 medication with the repeat, you just issue the first one and the other ones, you write them off. You can't issue it again from the same prescription. So we'll look at a prescription. Okay, so there we go. So you will see here, so here, this will be the prescriber's details. And what is required, obviously, from the prescriber's detail, it will be the name of the healthcare facility, but the name of the person themselves who's prescribing, or who's an owner of the healthcare facility and who's authorized to prescribe. Their address needs to be enacted there, and obviously contact details. And on contact details, you need to always have an emergency line where people can access you after hours or during emergencies. Then in South Africa, you will see that this one, it's an Australian registration, but in South Africa, you'll have either your HPCSA number with your practice number from BHF, and from SANC, you'll have that practice number from SANC, and then also from the Pharmacy Council, you'll still have the same a different registration number. Therefore, we move to the patient's details. You will see that on the patient's details, would need the name of the patient, the date of birth. This one, it's missing gender. You'll need to have gender. The other thing that you need to also look at when you on a prescription is that the weight, especially if you are dealing with pediatric patients, you need to always have the weight and geriatrics. But for most of our drugs, we know that they are weight dependent. So weight is very important that it appears on your prescription. So the other person on the other side, if you are issuing the prescription to be dispensed by somebody, to actually make sure that the patient is getting the right dose and at the right frequency. Then obviously it will be your prescription and the signature of the prescriber. And in some instances in South Africa, I think what I've seen now that is becoming more and more dominant is where prescribers get stamps. So you'll have a stamp that has your practice number, your contact details, your statutory number, which will either be your SANC, HPCSA, or the Pharmacy Council. So those details will appear on the stamp, and then you'll just sign on the section where it actually requires your signature. So what are the requirements of a legal prescription? And you'll see that on your evaluation form, it talks about the legality of a prescription, the validity of the prescription, its appropriateness. So those things, you would actually look at the factors that actually would be required. But the most important one, it's this section that talks about legal requirements, because this comes from the Act. So these are the regulations that would actually govern what makes a prescription legit or not. So the name and qualification and practice number of the authorized prescriber with their address needs to appear on top of the prescription. Then you have the name and address of the patient, the date in which you are issuing the prescription. This obviously comes because then for the prescription to be valid, it needs to be dispensed within 30 days of issue. So this would actually indicate whether the prescription is still valid or not. Then you have the approved name. Either it might be the proprietary name or the generic name of the medicine. Then the dosage form. Dosage form is very important because we have multiple dosage forms, and multiple dosage forms have different functions. Suppositories, the reason medications are given suppositories is that they get absorbed faster, but also some medications that are actually disintegrated by your gastric juice, then you need to bypass the stomach and then actually use the anal orifice to actually administer such medication. Then you'll have the strength of the medication. And here, what I've seen with strength is that it is very important that when you're using your unit standards, you actually be careful, especially when you're dealing with micrograms and grams. You'll find that people, when they write micrograms, they use the U-shaped and the G. That has caused confusion with certain people that actually write their M's that look the same as the U. So MCG people, it's more acceptable because then it shows that it's micrograms. Then you have quantities of the medication, obviously. How much are you actually dispensing to the patient? Then it's the instructions that you are giving the patient on how to administer the medication. And that obviously would include also the frequency, the age and sex. And you'll see that I've put weight in exclamation marks because that actually plays a factor when the medication is more dose dependent rather than looking at other factors that metabolize the drug. Then the number of repeats, if it's a repeat prescription, and mostly we know that repeat prescriptions are mostly chronic scripts where people are suffering from chronic conditions. Then the prescriber obviously needs to keep records of the diagnosis that is relevant to that prescription. And the other important thing around this issue is that the Act requires that the diagnosis be included on the prescription. And we know that we're using ICD-10 codes to communicate with other healthcare workers, but you can always request or ask for consent to put a diagnosis on the script if there's a need. But if there's no need, the diagnosis just needs to be in the patient file and then you keep it there. So generic medication substitution. I think some of you were looking for the non-substitutable drugs, and I think you have seen most of them. So here, generic drugs are considered to be equivalent to your proprietary drugs. Your proprietary drugs are patented drugs or drugs that are protected through trademarks and all sorts. So generic drugs are called interchangeable multi-source medicine. So what makes them equivalent to your originators is that they have the same active ingredients or substance or substances if it's a multi-dose drug, and they're identical in strength, concentration, and you see that all. Now I've put some asterisks on dosage form. Here I have a classic case where your Schedule 6 Concerta, it's methylphenidate. It has a generic drug, which is myelin methylphenidate. The generic is in a tablet form, and the originator is in a capsule form. But they have shown to be equivalent. So previously, when you are actually registering a generic, it needed to be in the same dosage form. So for it to be equivalent, it needs to be so if you're copying a capsule, it needs to also be in a capsule form. But then we have realized that now with advancement in dosage formulation, companies are managing to actually meet the requirements or the parameters of a bioequivalent generic without having to actually use the same dosage form. So they use different dosage forms, but still meet the requirements to be classified as a generic. Then obviously the route of administration, it cannot be a generic if it's not administered the same as the originator. So you can't say you are developing a Panadol tablet generic and yours needs to be actually administered rectally. Then it's not a generic. Then you have drugs with narrow therapeutic index, and these ones are the ones that you are looking for, which are usually classified as non-substitutable drugs. But then South Africa, interestingly enough, has more generic drugs than your branded or originated drugs. So you'll find that you'll have Cipla, phenytoin, and Aspen phenytoin, and Mylan phenytoin. All those would be generic drugs. But then, because the drug that you are actually giving to a patient, it has a narrow therapeutic index, you are not supposed to continuously switch from one generic to the other, because then the bioavailability of the drug becomes different because obviously of the therapeutic index. And what I'm talking about here, when we're talking about narrow therapeutic index, you would see here, it's this space here. So this is your therapeutic window. This is where you would get a response. So if you are talking about an asthmatic, the moment the concentration moves from 0 to here, you are supposed to actually get, bronchodilation from here. So what a narrow therapeutic index is when this space becomes smaller. And if you look on your right-hand side, it actually shows properly what I'm talking about. So drugs with wider therapeutic index would have a wider space where the drug would not reach its toxic concentration quicker. Whereas a drug that has a narrow therapeutic index is that it reaches its toxic concentration quicker after you have taken few doses. So this adverse response, the side effects that are dose dependent. So that means this peak here, this line, this one here, it goes down. So you find that the line is somewhere here. So it's very narrow. So that's the reason those drugs, we are not allowed to actually substitute them. Warfarin is one of them, where it's a non-linear kinetic. So if you give multiple doses, the increase in a therapeutic response, it's not equivalent. It might actually be exponential. Do you understand this section? So ethical consideration, yeah, I think most of us would know this. So there are 5 principles of ethical principle. Beneficence, you want to do good at all times. And then, having autonomy. Would you be influenced to prescribe? So self-independence. Would you be influenced to prescribe things that a patient was not supposed to actually get? Justice. You want to do good at all times. And here we're looking at veracity. That's why you're looking at quality. So in this case, because you'll be diagnosing, so you want to always offer quality healthcare services, you know, from assessment to diagnosis to a therapeutic plan, and then obviously to you choosing the right drug for you to actually reach the therapeutic outcome that you are requiring to fulfill. So if it's a hypertensive patient, you would want to reduce their high blood pressure to be within the normal range. And then confidentiality. Confidentiality is one important thing which sometimes as healthcare workers we not tend to overlook, but I think we get used to our environment that even sharing a patient's condition with a colleague and mentioning their name, it's actually a breach of confidentiality if you don't have consent from the patient. So it's very important that we familiarize ourselves with, you know, the ethical considerations around your prescribing and dispensing of medication. The other important one is the conflict of interest. So if you are involved, let's say in a clinical trial of a medication, or you are involved in the marketing of a certain drug from a certain company, and then what happens now is that you need to sit in a selection committee for formulation of a clinic formulary. Then you need to obviously indicate such conflict of interest, because if you don't indicate such a conflict of interest, then you would find yourself being conflicted, and there'll be what usually we'll refer to as pervasive incentive. Before, I think back in the years where you'd find that healthcare workers would get trips to go to overseas paid by pharmaceutical companies, but with a condition that when you come back, you're going to prescribe our drug throughout. So those things obviously would actually put patients at risk, because you would end up giving patients drugs that they don't need simply because you have obligations. So currently, as we speak, in the Medicine and Related Substances Act, it's actually an illegal act for somebody to actually receive pervasive incentives in return of them prescribing medication. So you are not allowed to be offered plane tickets to go overseas, and then when you come back and you would actually prescribe medication from a company that would have sponsored your trips to go, you know, wherever. So here you would see that if you are getting gifts from pharmaceutical companies, they need to be declared so that you don't find yourself practicing unethically. So this is what you would obviously see in your learning activity 1. The background was just to highlight, you know, the importance of you abiding by the law as you prescribe medication for patients, and also knowing what is required of you from a record keeping point of view, and then what a prescription needs to look like, and how you obviously need to write a prescription. So legality will be that section that we're looking at from your regulation, and you would see that it has all those aspects that appear on the legality section. And then the second one is authenticity. So how authentic is the prescription? So here, obviously, you would look at can you identify the patient who's standing before you? Do they have, you know, some identification? Is it an ID, a clinic card, a hospital card, or a driver's license? And would you be able to identify the prescriber? And here, obviously, the prescriber needs to have enacted their qualification first thing, because remember that the Medicine and Related Substances Act gives authority of prescribing to various healthcare workers, but also don't forget that there are limitations in prescribing. So you would see that nurses are only allowed to prescribe as per the South African Standard Treatment Guideline. Doctors would be allowed to prescribe throughout, but they will find that there are specialized drugs that can only be prescribed by specialists, oncology drugs, you know. So all those things would be outlined in the Act, where you'll find out the limitations of who can prescribe what. So enacting your qualification obviously helps whoever is dispensing. And then if you are dispensing yourself, obviously for audit purposes, they would see if whether you have practiced out of your scope or within your scope. And lastly, you need to have a recognizable signature. So you would see on your activities that some of the prescription have electronic generated signatures. Electronic generated signatures are unacceptable, so they cannot be accepted as valid. So there, what you need is that if it's an electronic signature, it must be the real specimen of your signature. So you sign somewhere and then import that signature into your computer, so that every time you want to, you just attach it to your prescription. And then validity, like I've said, it's highly dependent on the date of the prescription when it was actually issued. And then here, obviously, if you have repeats, you would see with the number of repeats that would have actually been written on the script. So if it's a 6 months repeat prescription, after the 6 months, it elapses. But you would see that there are always special circumstances. Like currently, a prescription of 6 months can be extended to 12 months because of the current situation of COVID-19. So those things, you would see that they'll always be published as per the Section 49 for amendments with the Medicine and Related Substances Act. But as soon as this current situation passes, that act or that section will probably be, withdrawn from the act, because then it's used only for special circumstances. Then appropriateness obviously would be highly aligned to, the condition of the patient. So if we're talking about dosage, the dosage will be dependent on the weight of the patient, their renal function, liver function. So contraindications, if there are any, patients with hypersensitivities, patients with, organ failure, chronic conditions, drug interactions. So the appropriateness obviously is highly related to the condition of the patient and the well-being of the patient. Then all these things you need to take into consideration when you're prescribing medication. For now, because it's Section 1, you would see later on when we're doing the pharmacological principles, how all these things actually come together, and then how you'd actually apply your pharmacological knowledge and your clinical knowledge to decide which drug to use over the other. And then in special instructions for, let's say, for patients who are using INR, what are the things that they need to look for? Also, the special instructions might also come for the prescriber to say, if you are prescribing tenofovir, you need to check the renal function of the patient before you can actually put the patient on the medication. So all those things are the special instructions that you need to look at. If you are administering amphotericin B in hospital, the first thing you need to do a test dose of 1 milligram and see if whether the patient reacts or not, rather than to just go ahead and give the drug. So all those things, they'll be what would obviously refer to as special instructions. The administration of flu vaccines. If you know that a person is allergic to eggs, you don't even attempt to actually give them a flu vaccine because it's actually inoculated in eggs embryos. So all those things would obviously need to be taken into consideration before you actually prescribe medication. And yeah, I think that's our first session. If any of you has some questions with regards to the actual work that we have been doing, you can actually raise them now. And I'll check here. I see there's some few things. Okay. Okay, did you all have a problem with the audio? Hello? Guys?
No, I joined late, unfortunately.
No, I was asking you for the audio.
No problem with the audio.
Hi, Joe.
Okay, so
okay, it's just the clicks, but otherwise it became better as you continued. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh no, maybe when I was changing the slides, I wonder maybe I need to switch off that. But yeah, do you have any questions with regards to section 1, and those who have maybe moved to other sections and you think there's something concerning you, you can also raise that and we can actually look at it.
So hi everyone, it's Dr. Mawela here. Obviously, from here you need to then do your first part of your POE. Not necessarily referring to the affidavit, but in terms of reviewing prescriptions that have been allocated as part of the portfolio of evidence. You would have to use whatever you have learned from this section to then review those prescriptions. Towards the end, we would then expect you to submit your full portfolio of evidence. So don't wait until the end to look or search for your POE. You need to start, you know, and using what has been taught here as guidance. Thank you.
Okay. So Ed Gugune, I hope you hear me. Actually, I think this one I'll raise it. She's the one who's asking the question. So I've taken the decision not to release the calculation to those who have already done the section. For one reason, there were just few people who have already done the calculation section. And what I've seen previously is that the moment I release the memo, then the memo starts flying around. So the memo gets shared, and then it forfeits the whole purpose of you attempting to actually do that section. And that section is actually the most important one. I think Les would attest that, you know, just a margin of a wrong calculation when administering medication, sometimes it's fatal, you know. So the more you actually practice and get the concepts right, the more you'd actually become accurate. And those who would be working with PEDS, it's very important that you really know how to calculate your doses, because you don't just write a standard dose for every child who walks in. So the moment I see that most of the people have actually done, so I'm monitoring, you know, the first group because I know the people who started the course. So the moment I see that at least 50 or 60% of you have done the calculation, and then we can actually start engaging on that. But what I'll do, I would actually also do a session on on the calculation, and then just maybe pick 1, 2, 3, or 5 of them, and then we can just go through those. But I'm not going to release the memo now until I have, at least half of the class that have actually completed the calculation, and then we can now engage on them.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Jonas.
Okay. I'm not sure who is this, but there's still someone who's struggling with the audio, but it's just written iPhone, so I'm not sure. Anyway, this session will be shared with you guys. We have recorded the session, so you can actually just go back and then listen to it, and then we can actually engage. What I've also decided to do is that from next week, you would get like twice a week, I'll give you activities that are aligned to your learning activities. So if it's a prescription, I'll give you a dummy prescription to actually just evaluate on top of what you are doing for your portfolio of evidence. Or alternatively, we can actually just look at one of the ones that it's on the portfolio of evidence, discuss one, and then you guys do the other two.